is to address illusions and stereotypes and remove illusions and stereotypes and work to see what would create a genuine reset in genuine civilization dialogue. And when I think about this and the importance of civilizational dialogue, there's a lot of fake dialogue out there. And the question, how do you get back to doing this? Now, many of us up here are storytellers. I'm a journalist, Ali's a journalist, we're storytellers. And oftentimes in stories, there are good people and there are villains, white hats and black hats. And I just want to start with you, Ahmed, and just ask you, as you look at this question of Orientalism, where it stands, who are the heroes and the villains of the moment that need to be surfaced so that we can get beyond them and begin getting to a reset in genuine dialogue and genuine understanding?
Wow, it's a difficult question. Allow me to start by thanking Her Excellency.
Just do it quickly.
Lolo Al-Khatir and the organizers, Dr. Hamza, for giving me the opportunity to be with you today. The question you're asking is not an easy question. There are no heroes and villains. There is knowledge that is accumulated over a period of time, and it's always important to engage with it critically. And to be able to do that, you need to understand it. You need to understand its historical origins, to unpack the historical legacies, to think about it critically, and engaging with it is quite important. And you know, probably we'll come back to this point later. Engaging with it, but also engaging with it critically and changing it, undermining some of the biases in this knowledge, but also, so understanding the historical legacy is very important, and engaging with it.
Let me just interrupt and ask you a different way. I know that you see Edward Said as one of the heroes.
Well, first of all, Edward Said was one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century.
Yes.
I mean, one of a handful of greatest thinkers. And
so what did Said set in motion that concerns you?
Well, Edward Said doesn't know the whole legacy of Orientalism, and he didn't claim to know it completely. But what he did is he was able to shed light on the power asymmetries that influenced the creation of knowledge in the West, in Europe, mainly in Europe, about the Middle East. He didn't really study German Orientalism. He didn't study American Orientalism, but one can make some additional assessments of these traditions. But he did shed light on the asymmetry of power, which was instrumental in the production of knowledge about the Middle East. And this is quite remarkable. Of course, he has many other contributions.
Safwan, let me ask you, I think that part of the equation here today that we've been discussing is power. Power to tell one's own story, or weakness in that equation that someone else is defining your story. And I'm just interested, as you see what we've just heard in discussing the black hats, the white hats, what has to be changed? To get to a genuine reset in civilizational dialogue, what has to change in that storytelling power?
Thank you. May I start by thanking Her Excellency?
Just as long as you do it quickly. We all love the organizers.
No, and I also want to thank Julia Granella. I'm very, very glad that you're here and that the Lusail Museum and the work that will come out of it and the collaborations that we will hopefully have together. First of all, you mentioned Edward Said. Edward was a colleague and a friend, and also Ahmed got his PhD at Columbia, and so we were contemporaneous at Columbia with Edward Said. And I recall, I think it was the 25th anniversary of Orientalism. Orientalism was published in 1978 and 1993 in Casa Italiana. Maybe you were there, Ahmed, when it was celebrated. And one would think that that's, by now we would have gone past it, right? But this is an age-old issue. And yes, some of it had its roots, as Dr. Esanoglu talked about, the Napoleonic invasion of 1798 that sort of, started opening the West to the Orient. But the notion of us versus them, it's not necessarily East versus West, but it's us versus them, and looking at people as different from us and us being superior has always been around, and I think it will always be there. And until and unless we're able to overcome that, unfortunately, that will continue to be the case. Now, you talked about power and the villains. I mean, to some extent, we are also villains in that. And it's not only, I mean, Said did not touch on this as much as others like Frans Fanon did before Orientalism. The notion of that has since been coined as self-orientalization, right? So the subjects of colonialism, the intellectual elites under colonialism, without even realizing it, use the same techniques and the same language of the colonizer. And then,
So they're complicit.
Of course, in a post-colonial world, sort of become agents of the same kind of thinking. What was referred to yesterday in the opening as Occidentalism, as perhaps the other side of the Orientalist coin. One can look at that as also vilifying the West, right? And celebrating, perhaps over-celebrating what the East represents. That also contributes to the sustenance of this issue of us versus them.
So let me come back to you and ask, we have a saying in the West of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I'm interested as we have this discussion about how to correct some of the negative consequences of a kind of hurtful, I mean, I'm going to put words into people's mouths, but hurtful Orientalism that's meant to demean or it's meant to diminish other people. How do you not do this? I want to introduce someone. Sonia, stand up for a minute. This is what I do. Sonia? Dr. Sonia is from Germany. She's really one of the world's great experts on mathematics, Arab mathematics, the history of mathematics. And she was on my panel this morning and really said that what she's doing is real science, real research, real history, looking at the political economy and the sociology of that time around mathematics and where that is, and that that's not something to go to war with, that's something to be defended as part of this. How do you defend and fit the equation in with the quality of important research on an age, a people, a time that is rich, empirical, and reasoned, and not necessarily fall into the equation of the negative dimensions of some of what we've been discussing in this conference?
Well, in an academic context, Orientalism is not the monopoly of Westerners. I mean, there are people who accept these what we refer to as Orientalist paradigms all over, including many people in our audience probably, or in our context, in our ethnic context. So it's not really, it's, when you're studying the Middle East, it's really the paradigms that you accept. The earliest forms of understanding, of knowledge about Islam in Europe were generated in the context of conflict. It was these are the very earliest forms. And by the way, people get to know each other, not always because they like each other. Sometimes when they're fighting with each other, they get to know each other. So these are the earliest forms of knowledge.
I prefer getting to know people by fighting with them.
Me too. But anyway, these are the earliest forms of knowledge. And then gradually there is a body of knowledge that it so happened that eventually what crystallized in the European context, which produced a body of knowledge about, is a focus on texts, what we refer to as philology, the study of texts and attributing authority to texts. Now, texts, philology could go in two directions. On the one hand, the text is fixed. A text can unseat, when you read it accurately, critically, it can unseat many of the biases that you have. Right. On the other hand, if you focus selectively on a set of texts to the exclusion of others, then you provide an interpretive framework that could be distortive. So a text can go, and in fact, historically, it has gone in very different directions. It's, do you read the text in their context, or do you read them selectively in order to frame a particular, eventually one of the main problems in the study of the East, and it's not everyone who studied the East who did this. One of the main problems is to try to essentialize difference, not explain difference, because there are absolute differences Within one culture, there are differences, and
Right.
certainly between East and West and so on. But to essentialize it and to attribute it
Right.
to very fixed traits that have to do with the very origin of the culture of the tradition. That is the problem. And that's a problem which is common in the study of the Islamic world everywhere, and regardless of
Right.
the identity of the person who studies.
So I want to come back to Dr. Safwan in a moment, but I have a paper that you've written. It says the study of Islam in American scholarship, the persistence of Orientalist paradigms, and it says, please do not quote. May I please quote it? Is it okay? Is it on the record? Okay, we're going to quote it. I'm going to quote it. Because in this, there's a line, and there are a number of people you outline are criticized in the field. And you say, despite the epistemological criticisms leveled against these leading scholars in the field of Islamic studies, in almost all cases, the narratives which they have generated have yet to be replaced with alternative narratives. I think it's a very important line, because isn't it easy to reject, and isn't it the responsibility of the rejector to put another idea or a competing or better idea on the table? And you're saying that's not happening.
Well, it happens. You know, our teacher, of course, is one of the examples. If I may, I will give him as an example. Look, many of the people who took the Orientalist critique, the critique of Orientalism to heart, instead of responding to the grand narratives that are generated by Orientalists, they chose very legitimately to focus on particular regions and particular areas, to root their studies in very rooted sociological analysis and historical analysis. But they shied away from providing a counter narrative to the large grand narrative of Orientalism. Of course, our teacher, Dr. Ahmed, has written comprehensive grand narratives,
Right.
you know, very deep, but also comprehensive, and that's very important. But I would argue that in the majority of cases, this didn't happen. What did this result in? As a result of this approach, as a result of the neglect of engaging with Orientalist tradition, which is full of knowledge,
Right.
there is a monopoly. This tradition still exercises a disproportionate monopoly of dictating the narrative of how we think in broad terms about the Muslim world. And that is a task that is still to be fulfilled.
Safwan, I want to address one of the big elephants in the room, which is the weaponization of an Orientalist framework to dehumanize and to demean other people. And we see it going on in real time with regards to a population of Palestinians in Gaza. We see it not only there, but frankly, we see it in the broader Middle East. And from my perspective, we've seen it since the so-called global war on terror, a term that I despise, was used to basically throw an entire civilization into a category that was feared and despised by much of the West and abused to justify other things. Now, that's my editorial opinion, but we have people dying right now as a result. I'd like to call it ignorance, but it doesn't seem ignorance. It seems to me to be a power equation using the slander, the stereotypes that are created in this. And I would love, you know, you're affiliated with Georgetown, which is sitting in Washington, D.C., where I live. To what degree, what DEFCON level do you think this problem is right now and that we ought to be discussing openly?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think it's multi-layered, right? So the weaponization that comes with the Orientalism and with the racism, basically, and the weaponization of the term Arab is what I want to focus on, has multiple dimensions to it, right? But it's all rooted in an imbalance of power, which is at the heart of Orientalism, which is a huge form of racism, right? Which, by the way, we are also complicit in, and I'll come back to this. And you know, by making sweeping generalizations about an entire region and developing, you know, and sort of Arab then becomes what's called a floating signifier, right? Which plays into the hands of authoritarian regimes. They love to be able to say, all Arabs are this, or all people from this part of the world or that part of the world are that. Whereas democracies, of course, thrive on intersectionality, right?
Yes.
Which is sort of the opposite of that floating signifier paradigm. What that has done, that's very, very dangerous and that's weaponized in the case of Palestinians, is multi-layered. At one level, by making Palestinians interchangeable with Arabs through an Orientalist lens, has rid Palestinians of the ownership of their heritage and of their identity, making Palestinians interchangeable with another 450 million people in 22 countries.
Right.
This is what enables Trump to be able to think of the people of Gaza, they can live in Somalia. Okay, isn't it a member of the League of Arab Nations, for example? The insistence within Palestine, historic Palestine, Israel, on referring to Palestinians as Arabs, the Arabim. Okay, there is no such thing as Palestinian. And we, of course, also contribute to this. Ahmed, what do we refer to the people who stayed behind in 1948? Arab 48. ما بنقول فلسطينية 48, right? So part of that weaponization we have fed into and we have become complicit in. Obviously, the other form of weaponization that you're also talking about is the terrorist, the Muslim, right? You know, I had to remind my colleagues at Georgetown soon after October 7 that Christians in Gaza are being attacked, right? That the Al-Ahli hospital, the first hospital to be attacked, is actually the Baptist hospital in Gaza. So to go back to your question, obviously, I mean, you know, painting the Palestinian as a Muslim terrorist, you know, you're Muslim, you're brown, right? And that clearly feeds into the Orientalist tropes that justify, if you will, in the centers of
What
power.
has been surprising to me, and I'll talk to Ali in Al Jazeera, many of you know Al Jazeera, what's been shocking to me in this is to watch people shot and killed by snipers in broad daylight, clearly unarmed, clearly innocent, clearly in different ways, and that unlike the Vietnam War, where TV undid the narratives, TV is not undoing the narratives of this right now, and it's something for us to consider. I want to ask you, as we just wrap up this and bring it to an end, I'm going to ask you two questions, but first to Ahmed is, we were talking about Bernard Lewis and Malcolm McDonald, and about narratives of each of these two players. My understanding is you see Malcolm McDonald talked about the Arab world as a redeemable world, as a redeemable civilization. Bernard Lewis wrote about it as Muslims are hopeless. I want to ask, do we need a third competitive text for those?
Sure, I'll answer the question, but if I may, I want to also refer to the earlier point that was being discussed. You know, Duncan MacDonald is considered the founder of American Orientalism. And you know, I quote in the paper, as you read, I quote lots of his, what he says. His view was there is an element of truth in the Islamic tradition, but it's distorted. And Muslims can be redeemed if you can bring them back. There are other Orientalists who wanted to bring back Muslims to rationality, or bring back to true belief, which is Christianity or whatever it might be. But his engagement with the Islamic tradition was genuine. He believed in the possibility of something better that could happen. It's problematic from an academic point of view, but it's genuine. Bernard Lewis argued quite that Muslims are hopeless. The only thing to do
in my view, Bernard Lewis has become the dominant frame for most of what we've seen.
Absolutely, and it influenced policy. And Bernard Lewis basically argued that there is the only thing that you could do with the Arab and Muslim world is to dominate it, and specifically the Arab Muslim world is to dominate it and control it. So Muslims to him were
the third text.
But here are two different types of look today. If I may come back to the issue of weaponizing Orientalism and so on, some of the bravest defenders of our common humanity are Jews and Christians who are driven by their belief systems. And that's very important. You know, they see what's happening and they refuse it, they reject it. So, and they're driven, by the way, if you think of their, I don't know what every one of those people thinks, but I bet there are wrong from an academic point of view, they have wrong concepts. But as far as the modern politics is concerned, they are driven by the belief system to defend our common humanity. They don't accept what they see happening, the massacre that is unfolding before our eyes. And this is very important. And again, it's important, regardless of their academic. So the academic and the humane, they feed into each other, but they're not the same.
Right.
And we have to keep that in mind. And there is a lot of good in this world, but there is also huge power asymmetry that's resulting in massive disasters everywhere we look. We need to capitalize.
Let me just ask you both very finally, quite quickly. And I hate to be trite about this, but if you think there's one contribution that this conference, this convening, a gathering of experts in this has got to be one of the most significant platforms in the world to do this, to commit to this. What is one of the levers that you think, from your perspective, needs to be pulled in a new direction to move the field, but also the civilizational dialogue forward in a healthy way?
I leave the field to Ahmed because this is an area of deep scholarship for him. But I'll tell you, sort of, in terms of social change, in terms of what's required, we win the battle when we stop asking the question, how are we being seen, but rather, what are we creating?
Right.
Okay, who are we? How do we see ourselves, and thus how does the world see us? And I'm not saying this gratuitously, but I think Qatar leads the way in that, in that it is allowing for a definition of what is genuine and authentic, and celebrates the past, but defines the future in a particular way, in a very sort of authentic and unique way. And I think this conference represents that. So one thing that I would take away from this is we reclaim our present, we reclaim our past, we reclaim our future, we define our future, and we going back to something Ahmed said earlier, even within the academy, depart from making Orientalism the monopoly of the West, right? You discuss it from within. In yesterday's opening, I was also struck by the fact that when you look at the great philosophers who came out of this part of the world, Ibn Sina, Ibn Khaldun, and so on, they're often relegated to the study of the Middle East, which is another Orientalist term, right?
Right.
As opposed to sort of teaching them when you teach all the other great philosophers of the West. So, and since then, I've actually asked for a look at the syllabi of all of our philosophy courses to see how it fits. So, taking a very hard look at how we tell our story. And how we define ourselves. And I'll end with something that Ghassan Salama also said yesterday in the opening about identity, and the fact that you are not born with an identity stamped on your head, right? Identity is something that you own. It's a living organism. You develop and it evolves, and it becomes certain layers, and it's multi-layered, and some layers become sharpest when they become under threat.
Terrific. Ahmed?
I'll restrict myself, as Safwan directed me, to the academic side.
You're going to take exception to that.
No.
Oh, you're going to agree. You're going to let him define you.
So, look, many of our students. I'm answering as Safwan suggested. Many of our students, and I see this quite often. Before I was consumed by administration, I used to teach. Many of our students, driven by frustration, a sense of unfairness in the world in which we live and so on, say, that's it, we will not accept the Western legacy, and we want to create an alternative paradigm.
Right.
I think this is wrong. We have to engage with knowledge as it exists, as it defined by a community of scholars, and as we engage with it, we modify it. We have to write ourselves into a global narrative, into a global discourse, which is understandable across the globe, regardless of our identities. Engage with it, and in the process of doing that, this is how academics should behave, whether they're studying the Middle East, whether they're studying anything in any subject. You engage with the body of knowledge as it's defined by a community of scholars, and in the process of that, you modify the paradigm brick by brick.
So when I tell the story of this panel one day, you both have white hats. You're not villains in the story. I want to thank you for the major contributions you're both making. Please give a big round of applause to Ahmed Dallal, President of the American University in Cairo, and Safwan al-Masri, Dean of the Georgetown University in Qatar. Thank you both.